Hello, everybody, and welcome to an article breakdown video here on the channel. Today, we are going to be discussing CABS theory by Marshall Sutcliffe, a fundamental limited strategy article that all players should know and be able to understand to make them better. Especially if you're a new player, it is absolutely essential to understand CABS theory. So today we are going to be breaking it down because the original article came out almost 10 years ago at this point, so you may have missed it. The author is Marshall Sutcliffe, who, if you don't know, is the host of the Limited Resources podcast. He is the greatest teacher of Limited in the history of the game. He has helped so many players get better, and today we are going to be going through his article to help you benefit from his timeless wisdom as well. I will be explaining any of the older examples to help make sure that this article makes sense for you in the modern text as well. Magic Origins was actually the first set that I drafted from start to finish, so that's a pretty nostalgic set for me as well. And that is the set that was current when Marshall was making this article, and so it will be the place where all the cards are from and stuff like that. Anyway, without further ado, let's dive on in. After 5 weeks of deep dives on the colors of Magic Origins, and Magic Origins was like a core set, essentially, if you imagine that, something like MTG Foundations, but it was like a set that was basically designed to be a little bit simpler. I figured it would be good for you and me to take a step back. I like hitting a mix of current set-specific topics and also bigger picture strategic topics in this column. That way, you can stay up to date on the latest happenings, but also continue to march your overall game abilities in the forward direction. I talk a lot here and on the podcast and basically wherever else they let me about improving in Limited. I do this because I find winning to be more fun and because I believe improving at basically anything is a worthy pursuit. I've also noticed that the skills you need to be good in Limited often translate to real life, which I didn't expect when I started this journey. Anyway, we are going to talk about fundamentals and CABS theory this week on the column. This may be the best way to quickly improve at Booster Draft. It's fun because some players called it Booster Draft, and now we just call it Draft, which is kind of just how the world works. It's in contrast to something like Cube Draft. Board affecting cards or nothing. It doesn't affect the board state, though. And for those of you that don't know, the board state is basically like if you were playing and where your lands and creatures go, that's like the board state. So if someone were to like walk over to your game, they wouldn't necessarily look at the cards in each player's hand, but they would look at the board state to like see, okay, this person has 3 creatures in play, they have 1, this person has 6 lands. That's kind of like the board state. It doesn't affect the board state, though. I've said this so many times, I've even said it in this column, I'm sure. It's something I think about a lot when I'm evaluating a card or building a deck, or making a choice in a booster draft. My theory is that you can only have so many cards that don't affect the board state directly before your deck starts to suffer. I call this CABS theory, which is short for cards that affect the board state. Most people don't factor in whether a card affects the board or not when they evaluate a card. The questions are usually centered around outright power level, rate, basically the vanilla test, but for all cards. Think efficiency. And the vanilla test is basically another card evaluation tool that Marshall uses, where you just basically look at the stats you're getting for a card for the amount of mana you're paying for it. So if you have like a card that has a bunch of abilities, you kind of just remove those abilities and just instead examine the card as, oh, this is a 2-mana 2/2, or this is a 3-mana 3/3, or something like that. You're like, okay, that's the vanilla test. So just as a way of simplifying the cards that you're thinking about. But basically, the efficiency would be like, oh, this is a 3-mana 4/3, that's a pretty good rate, or something like that. But the questions are usually centered around outright power level, rate, basically the vanilla test, but for all cards, think efficiency, overall mana cost, etc. And this makes some sense too. After all, many very strong cards don't directly affect the board state at all. And so when he says rate, he means like efficiency of removal, so like 2-mana deal 4, or things like that. Let's stop here and define what I mean when I say affects the board state. There are 3 types of cards that affect the board state, and they are creatures. Creatures are easily the most important card type in Limited. It's not close either. 99% of Limited games are won with creatures. Creatures give you a way to stay alive, they are a way to come from behind, and they are the way you win. They are recurring sources of damage, and they can function as virtual removal spells while blocking. They are the most proactive things you can do in Limited. Removal. Removal spells are the scarcest of the 3 resources here, and they are important because they kill the most important thing, creatures. Being a scarce commodity means that they will often get picked ahead of creatures in draft. What he means here is that even like all removal spells are valuable partially because there are less removal spells than creatures, because a deck has to have multiple a ton of creatures to function. So if you just imagine it from the way your deck is being built, if you have like 15 creatures and 3 removal spells, each of those 3 removal spells is pretty important because you have less of them, so you're only going to draw like 1 or 2 removal spells in a game. Whereas with creatures, you have a lot of creatures, and so that's why removal being scarce makes it more valuable, because there's a lot of creatures in packs to draft and pick up because they're such fundamental pieces of limited, but removal spells, there's less of them in packs, and so they are generally pretty high picks, especially when they are efficient. So that's what he means by it being scarcest in a draft. Combat tricks. Combat tricks affect the board directly, assuming you have at least one creature. They are riskier and the least important of the 3 categories, but they do have their place. Ideally, they function similar to removal, as they help you win combat by making your creature big enough to kill the opposing blocker. So a combat trick would be something like an instant speed spell that gives your creature a temporary stats boost. That's pretty much the definition of a combat trick. So if you spend like 2 mana to give your creature +3/+3 or something like that, or 1 mana to give your creature +2/+2, or those sorts of cards, they're a temporary effect in most cases. Sometimes it'll be slightly more permanent, like 1 mana, put a +1/+1 counter on your creature or something like that. But generally these cards are going to be temporary stats boosts that help you win combat. And the reason he says they'll function like removal is because if you attack with your creature, your opponent blocks with their creature, all of a sudden, if you use a combat trick to win that combat, your combat trick essentially traded for your opponent's creature. And so that's kind of what he means by combat tricks being essentially a removal spell in those cases, hopefully being a removal spell, because combat tricks don't have to be prioritized as highly in draft as good removal spells and good creatures do. And so if you can use a combat trick as a removal spell, that's a pretty nice benefit to have. But basically, moving on, these are the card types that make up a good CABS deck. There is more to the equation, however. Turning page. Here are your CABS commandments. You will not splash extra colors. You will play 2 colors, no more. There is no such thing as a free splash. Some sets are slightly different because they're designed with 3 colors in mind, but in general, think CABS deck, 2 colors, no splashes. 2, you will have a good mana curve. This will prioritize the 2 and 3 mana slots for creatures. You will avoid 7 drops. So what he's saying here is have a lot of cheap plays, and avoiding 7 drops is basically 7 drops are so expensive that you're not going to be able to cast them in a conventional game where you're curving out, because you have to kind of build with your 7 drop in mind, either by trying to get to the late game or by having some ramp elements, and ramp elements are not cards that affect the board state, and building for the late game kind of goes against this kind of good mana curve idea. Not that you can't have a good mana curve and build for the late game, but these idea that you're going to play 2 and 3 mana creatures, cards that affect the board state, and these late game 7 mana plays are going to get stuck in your hand if you're building this sort of strategy. You will have 15 to 18 creatures in your deck. That is going to be essential for leveraging this CABS strategy, so your combat tricks will do stuff, your removal spells will be high leverage. 4, you will avoid card draw spells, build around me enchantments, counter spells, life gain spells, and the like. Those are cards that do not affect the board state. 5, every card in your deck will have a low setup cost. Your cards stand on their own, they don't require any gymnastics to be good. Marshall has written an article on setup cost. I've covered it in another article breakdown on this channel. Basically, setup cost means that it needs something else to be good. So a card that, let's just say, for example, in a creature that's like a 2 mana 1/1, but if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, it gets a massive stats boost and gets like +2/+2 or something like that. So as soon as you put a counter on it, the card becomes incredible, but without that counter, the card is kind of wimpy and not particularly great. You don't really want to be putting those cards in your deck if you're trying to build a low setup cost deck, because you're just trying to make sure every card is good on its own. So like a 2 mana 2/2 would be better than that card in this sense, because you don't want to have to put in the extra effort to build around this card. And so that's kind of what he's saying with a low setup cost card. 6, you will have a simple, clear game plan of beating down your opponent. No milling or combos, just beats. Milling is when you try to win the game by your opponent running out of cards in their deck, which is sometimes a niche strategy in sets, sometimes a little bit more than niche, but almost always just a very like corner case scenario. You'll have like build around cards to do that. You just want to be focused on clear game plan of beating down your opponent. And again, that's why you're avoiding 7 drops as well. You will prioritize solid doubles over strikeouts/home run cards. This means that you want cards that are consistently good rather than cards that are sometimes very good, but sometimes very bad. So this is a baseball analogy. So if you have never played baseball, you don't know the rules, a double is basically like you're really happy with a double. A double is a really good hit, and a strikeout home run card would be a card that's either the absolute best or the absolute worst. Striking out is the worst, home run is the absolute best. And so you'd rather have a bunch of cards that are very solid versus a card that is sometimes going to be amazing, sometimes going to be terrible, because you're trying to be a very fundamental, solid, sound approach to the game with your CABS deck. In a nutshell, CABS theory sets a fundamental baseline for what a limited deck should look like. Your most fundamental limited deck would contain only cards that fit the criteria above. That's it. Every card in your deck is a creature, a removal spell, or a combat trick. every single one. And of course, he does not mean that you're not going to play lands. You will also play lands, but that is not exactly what he means. But yes, every single card is a creature, removal spell, or a combat trick, or of course a land. Try it. I know it can be painful not to play some sweet, non-board affecting card. There are good ones that deserve a slot in most decks that can draft them, but your most fundamental deck will not contain cards like this. The reasoning here is that if you get great at drafting rock-solid CABS-style decks, you'll have a baseline from which to make the decisions on when to break those rules. Here's a personal story to help illustrate this point. I played basketball when I was in high school. It was pretty much all I thought about back then. I lived and breathed it. It was my first true passion. And when I made it onto the high school team of the school I had recently moved to, I was super stoked. You see, I grew up playing street ball, basically disorganized basketball played outdoors. No referees, no consistent teams, and with a set of rules that has differences to true organized ball. But the coaches liked enough of what they saw in me and gave me a chance. The problem was that I had never played real organized basketball before. I didn't even know how to do most of the practice drills. You know, the drills the other players had been doing since they were small children. I could do the actual actions within the drill, but the drills themselves were foreign to me. Seismic Elemental saying, "Put me in, coach." Classic. When we played practice games, I had some sweet moves I had worked on in the street. They worked in the games I played growing up. Why wouldn't they work now? The problem, if the player defending me figured out where I was going with my move, they could stop me, and I didn't have the ability to adjust because I lacked fundamentals. My coach told me that I would have to work on the fundamentals of the game before I could bust out the fancy moves I had worked so hard on. But he was a good coach, and I trusted him, so I put in a lot of effort getting the foundation built right. Along the way, I was tempted to use my old moves because I knew that they would get the job done in that moment, but I didn't because I knew that it would undermine my overall development as a player. After putting the work in, my fundamentals improved and I was able to build out a much wider range of moves than I had previously. Working from a solid fundamental starting point gave me the ability to break out of it when the opportunities presented themselves. CABS theory is about getting your fundamentals straight so that you know what a rock-solid draft deck looks like before you go chasing build-around-me uncommons and crazy combos. Ultimately, your best possible draft decks will contain a carefully considered combination of CABS cards plus non-CABS cards and strategies as well. But if you don't have the ability to build a super solid CABS-style deck, you won't know when it's correct to deviate from your fundamental base. I know a lot of high-level professional players who effectively use CABS-style drafting as their baseline strategy with great success. Catching cabs. He's great with these analogies. A cab is like a taxi cab, for those of you that are not familiar with the phrase in the real world. Catching cabs. Playing good cards on time almost every game. You'll take full advantage of people who don't draft this way. You'll have fewer instances of mulligans because you'll have a good mana curve, only 2 colors, and exclusively spells that actually do something when you cast them. You'll also run over the players who are not drafting in this style when they stumble on mana, can't cast their expensive spells, draw multiple cards that don't affect the board state, or simply have a slow start. A lot of the times, these are just general aggro rules, but a lot of the times as well, aggro decks tend to be CAB-style decks in general, because aggro decks are mostly interested in cards that affect the board state. Aggro decks don't cram in card draw. Aggro decks don't cram in enchantments that don't really do much or give you some like weird late game advantage. The aggro decks are focused on playing creatures, playing combat tricks, playing removal spells. So if you just look at a typical aggro deck in most sets, they are going to be generally very CAB-style decks. And these slower, more control-y decks are going to be the ones that play card draw, play counter spells, play weirder things like that. And so just keeping that in mind, a CABS deck is fundamentally almost always an aggro deck because that's just what you get when you put a lot of 2 and 3 drops in your deck, a lot of combat tricks and removal in your deck, and play like 15 to 18 creatures. That's kind of how CABS is going to function. So all the stuff he's saying about playing a CAB style deck is kind of like general truths about playing an aggro deck, and that's because there is a lot of overlap between playing these, and also playing aggro decks is generally a little bit easier than playing these late game control decks because you make fewer decisions. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, but basically you're playing to the board state, so you don't have to think about the complex late game scenarios that come up in in control matchups, like, oh, what do I have to use my removal on? Well, I have to save this for their late game bomb. Those sorts of things, which in an aggro deck, you're like, okay, I'll kill their blocker, clear the way for my attacks, things like that. Though, of course, aggro is skill testing as well. It's just, there's generally, when you're playing creatures on curve, it's a little bit simpler. Here's an example to show you how simple yet effective this strategy can be. Say we are on the play in a Magic Origins draft, and we start out with a Cleric of the Forward Order on turn 2. So Cleric of the Forward Order is a 2-mana 2/2, and then it gains you some life if you play other Clerics of the Forward Order, but basically 2-mana 2/2, think about that. On turn, our opponent plays their second land and passes the turn. We attack for 2 with the cleric, play our third land, and cast Knight of the Pilgrim's Road before passing the turn. So Knight of the Pilgrim's Road is a 3-mana 3/2 with Renown 1. So basically, when it deals damage to a player, it'll get a counter on it and become renowned. Our opponent plays a land and plays Read the Bones, falling to 16 life. So Read the Bones is a powerful card draw spell. It's 2 and a black for scry 2, then draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life. So a nice card advantage engine, a nice card selection engine as well because of the scry 2. And especially at the time, it was a pretty good card because cards were a little bit lower power level 10 years ago, as you might imagine. But basically, you've gone on your turn 2-drop into 3-drop, and your opponent missed their 2-drop and then played a card draw spell that loses you life. And that's why you don't really want to be, that's why you need cards that affect the board in all decks, because if you're playing like a card draw spell as your first spell and they've done this, then you are in real bad shape. If we pause here, we see how powerful this strategy can be versus someone who isn't playing this way. We are already attacking for a minimum of 5 damage on our turn because you have a 2/2 and a 3/2, putting our opponent to 11 life. With almost any reasonable creature, combat trick, or removal spell, we are going to be firmly in the driver's seat to win the game, regardless of what creature our opponent finds with Read the Bones. So even if they play a 4-mana 4/4 or something big, if you have a removal spell or a combat trick to attack past it, you just like deploy that, keep curving out, and your opponent is just super toasted. I intentionally used mid-level cards in this scenario. We could have gone Taupe Freeblade, which was like the best 2-drops in the set. It was a 2-mana 2/2 Vigilance with Renown 1. So if you played this on turn 2 on the play and your opponent didn't have a blocker, then you would hit them and all of a sudden you had like a 3/3 Vigilance creature for the rest of the game, and your opponent was just like, they can't attack you with their Renown creatures. It was kind of a snowballing mechanic in that way. Or into Acolyte of the Inferno, which is a 3-mana 3/1 with Renown. When it becomes blocked, it deals 2 damage to that creature, which also makes it hard to block because that creature is going to take 2 damage before it even does anything. So this often would then grow and be a 4/2 or whatever. Or Citadel Castellan, which is Renown 2. So it's a 3-mana 2/3 Vigilance, but when it hits them, it becomes a 4/5 Vigilance, which again, just if your opponent is playing Read the Bones and you're getting a 4/5 Vigilance that's just 3 mana, you're going to crush them. for a real pounding. If you have been struggling with limited and just can't seem to find your groove, try CABS drafting. You'll see the power that comes with never missing a beat, and after you get it down, you can start branching out into non-CABS cards as you see fit. As I said earlier, CABS drafting is meant to be a baseline, but not necessarily the end game for your strategic development. Until next week, Marshall. Hopefully you found this video helpful. Hopefully you found the explanations and clarifications a little bit helpful as well. I really do hope you enjoyed this article breakdown, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to share this gem of wisdom with all of you, especially if you didn't get to read it when it came out yourself almost 10 years ago. That's going to do it for this video, though. If you did enjoy it, hit the thumbs up button to let me know. Comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. Subscribe for more videos like this one. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave #CABS to let me know in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way till the end and enjoyed the video. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.